From betrayed wife to CEO, how she turned Christmas humiliation into sweet justice. True story of 2024. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. We upload videos every day at 2 p.m. Don't miss out. Subscribe now and stay tuned for amazing stories. The Benjamin Tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like an obsidian blade, its 90 stories of gleaming glass and steel casting long shadows over the lesser buildings cowering in its presence. From his penthouse office on the top floor, Nathaniel Benjamin stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying his domain with the cold calculation of a predator studying its hunting grounds. At 45, he cut an imposing figure against the floor-to-ceiling windows. His bespoke Tom Ford suit, charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes, was tailored to perfection, emphasizing his broad shoulders and athletic build, maintained by daily sessions with his personal trainer. Salt and pepper hair, artfully styled to suggest both authority and sophistication, framed a face that graced the covers of business magazines and society pages alike. But beneath the polished veneer of success lay something darker, a festering hatred that had taken root in his childhood and grown twisted and strong over the decades. The son of old money, raised in exclusive enclaves and educated in private institutions, Nathaniel had cultivated his prejudices like precious orchids in a hothouse, nurturing them with selective evidence and carefully curated experiences. Mr. Benjamin, his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting his contemplation of the city below. The candidates for the junior analyst position are here for their interviews. A thin smile crossed his faces as he pressed the response button. Send in the first one in 15 minutes. I need to review their files again. Returning to his massive mahogany desk, Nathaniel opened the leather portfolio containing the day's interview schedule. His eyes lingered on one resume in particular. Arabella Sebastian, recent magna cum laude graduate from Washington University. Her academic credentials were impeccable, her recommendations glowing. Her photograph showed a striking young woman with deep brown skin and intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. Perfect, he whispered, running his finger along the edge of her resume. She was exactly what he was looking for. Brilliant, ambitious, and completely unsuspecting of the trap he was about to set. Nathaniel had done this before, though never with quite so much planning. His previous marriages had been learning experiences, each one helping him refine his technique. The pattern was always the same. Find a successful, educated woman of color, court her with grand gestures and promises of a shared future, marry her in spectacular fashion, then destroy her publicly and utterly. Each time, he made sure his prenuptial agreements were ironclad, leaving his victims with nothing but shattered dreams and public humiliation. But this time would be different. This time would be his masterpiece. Opening his laptop, he pulled up the dossier his private investigators had compiled on Arabella Sebastian. Top of her class in both high school and college. Active in community service. No serious relationships in her past. Close to her family, especially her widowed mother. Ambitious, but not mercenary. Idealistic without being naive. The psychological profile suggested someone who would be susceptible to mentorship, to guidance from an established figure in her chosen field. Someone who could be molded, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed. Nathaniel's fingers drummed against his desk as he reviewed his strategy. The role of distinguished mentor would come first, gradually shifting to that of an admirer, impressed by her intelligence and capability. He would be careful to maintain professional boundaries initially, letting others in the office notice her exceptional work before making any personal overtures. The progression had to seem natural, inevitable even. He glanced at his watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people's annual salary, and straightened his tie. In 5 minutes, he would begin the performance of a lifetime. Every gesture, every word would be calculated to begin weaving a web of manipulation so subtle that his target wouldn't feel the silk strands until they had already bound her completely. The intercom buzzed again. "Sir, Miss Sebastian is here for her interview." Nathaniel stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced elegance. He would be charming, but not overly so. Professional with just a hint of warmth. The foundation had to be laid carefully, brick by brick, until the fortress of her trust was complete and ready to be demolished at his pleasure. "Send her in," he commanded, moving to stand before his desk. As the heavy wooden door began to open, a predatory gleam flickered in his eyes, quickly masked by a welcoming smile. The game was about to begin. A fresh graduate's dreams. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of Arabella Sebastian's modest Brooklyn apartment, casting warm patterns across her carefully laid-out interview outfit. She stood before her full-length mirror, a graduation gift from her mother, adjusting the collar of her navy blazer with trembling fingers. At 23, she carried herself with a grace that belied her youth, her dark skin glowing with hope and determination. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection, smoothing down her precisely pressed white silk blouse. The outfit had cost nearly a month's rent, but as her mother always said, "Dress for the life you want, not the life you have." And Arabella wanted more than just a job. She wanted to prove that a girl from a working-class family in Brooklyn could make it to the very top. Her phone buzzed on the vintage vanity beside her. A text from her mother. "Baby girl, you're going to shine today. Remember what your father always said, excellence isn't about being better than others, it's about being better than you were yesterday. Love you." Arabella's throat tightened as she read the message. Her father had been gone for 5 years now, but his wisdom still guided her every step. A respected community college professor, he had instilled in her a love of learning and an unwavering belief in her own potential. His life insurance had helped pay for her education at Washington University, and she was determined to make that sacrifice count. Picking up her leather portfolio, another graduation splurge, she checked its contents one last time. Her resume, printed on premium paper, sat pristine in its sleeve. Multiple copies, just in case. Letters of recommendation from her professors, a USB drive containing her thesis on emerging market dynamics in developing economies. Everything was perfect, just as she had planned. The ride to Manhattan on the subway was a blur of mental preparation. Arabella reviewed potential interview questions under her breath, earning curious glances from fellow passengers. She had researched Benjamin Enterprises extensively, their market position, recent acquisitions, corporate culture. The junior analyst position would be competitive, but she knew she was more than qualified. Emerging from the subway station, she was struck anew by the imposing presence of the Benjamin Tower. Its sleek facade seemed to touch the clouds, a testament to ambition made manifest. Taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air, Arabella straightened her shoulders and walked toward the building's revolving doors. The security desk in the marble lobby was efficiently managed by 2 guards who checked her ID and interview appointment. "Floor 90, one of them said, handing her a visitor's badge. "Express elevator on the right." As the elevator climbed, Arabella's stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She had excelled at Washington University, graduating magna cum laude, but this was different. This was real life, with real stakes. Her mother had worked double shifts as a nurse to help support her dreams, and now everything hinged on this interview. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area that screamed power and privilege. The walls were adorned with original artwork, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum of modern design. A sleek desk of glass and steel was manned by an immaculately groomed woman who looked up at Arabella's approach. "Miss Sebastian, for the junior analyst position?" "Yes, that's correct." Please have a seat. Mr. Benjamin will be ready for you shortly. Arabella perched on the edge of a designer chair, her portfolio balanced on her knees. Other candidates, all in suits that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, sat in various stages of practiced nonchalance. She noticed she was the only person of color in the waiting area, but that wasn't unusual in her experience. If anything, it made her more determined to succeed. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as she waited. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see most of Manhattan spread out below, a concrete jungle where she was determined to make her mark. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Remember, Bella, in that world, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as far. But you, my girl, you're 10 times as good." "Miss Sebastian?" The receptionist's voice cut through her memories. "Mr. Benjamin will see you now." Standing, Arabella smoothed her skirt one last time and followed the receptionist to a set of imposing double doors. As they swung open, she caught her first glimpse of Nathaniel Benjamin, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. He stood framed against the Manhattan skyline, tall and distinguished, with an air of command that seemed almost palpable. When he turned to greet her, his smile was warm and appraising, but something flickered in his eyes. Something predatory that was gone so quickly, she convinced herself she had imagined it. "Miss Sebastian," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but not overwhelming, professional yet personal. "Welcome to Benjamin Enterprises. I've been looking forward to meeting you." As Arabella took her seat across from his massive desk, she had no way of knowing she was walking into a trap years in the making. She saw only opportunity, a chance to prove herself in the world of high finance. She couldn't have known that her impressive resume, her perfect grades, her very determination to succeed had marked her as prey for a man who had turned destruction into an art form. "Tell me," Nathaniel Benjamin said, leaning forward with seemingly genuine interest, "where do you see yourself in 5 years? Arabella took a deep breath and began to answer, unaware that she was speaking the first lines of what would become both a fairy tale and a nightmare. Outside the windows of the Benjamin Tower, Manhattan glittered in the morning sun, indifferent to the drama beginning to unfold 90 stories above its streets. The spider's web. Nathaniel Benjamin was a master of the long game. As he sat in his study late one evening, 3 months after Arabella's interview, he reviewed his meticulous notes on his phone, chronicling every calculated move in his elaborate scheme. The leather-bound chair creaked softly as he leaned back, swirling aged scotch in a crystal tumbler, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. The first phase had gone perfectly. After hiring Arabella, he'd assigned her to the emerging markets team, ensuring she would regularly need to present findings directly to him. Each presentation became an opportunity to lay another strand in his web. A thoughtful question here, a word of praise there, all carefully measured to build her confidence while fostering dependency on his approval. "Sir," he remembered telling her after a particularly impressive presentation on Southeast Asian markets, "your analysis shows remarkable insight. Remind me of your background in the region." He had leaned forward, maintaining exactly the right amount of eye contact, his expression a masterful blend of professional interest and personal appreciation. Arabella had blossomed under his attention, just as he'd planned. He'd watched her transformation with predatory patience, how she began to stay later at the office, how her eyes would light up when he stopped by her desk with seemingly casual questions about her projects. The security footage on his private server documented everything. Arabella working late into the night, determined to exceed his expectations. Her subtle changes in appearance, more sophisticated clothing, elegant jewelry she could barely afford. He particularly enjoyed the clips showing her reaction to his accidental touches. A hand at the small of her back while looking at her computer screen, fingers brushing as he handed her documents. "You're playing a dangerous game, Nathaniel," his friend Richard had warned over lunch at their private club. "These things have a way of backfiring." But Richard didn't understand the artistry of it all. Nathaniel had perfected his technique through 3 previous marriages, each ending with his victims publicly humiliated and financially ruined. Arabella would be his masterpiece, young, brilliant, and completely unsuspecting. The second phase had begun 2 weeks ago. He'd arranged for her to overhear a conversation with his CFO about his loneliness since his last divorce, his desire to find someone who understood both his business mind and his heart. The next day, he'd appeared unusually vulnerable during their private meeting about market projections. "Sometimes I wonder," he'd said, staring out at the city lights, his voice carefully modulated to suggest hidden depths of emotion, "if success is worth the isolation it brings." He turned to find her watching him with sympathy, concern, and something more, exactly as he'd intended. The flowers had started arriving at her desk the following week. Rare orchids, her favorite after he'd coincidentally discovered her interest in botany. Each arrangement came with a handwritten note, his words calculated to seem both professional and charged with unspoken meaning. Tonight, he was reviewing the footage of her receiving today's delivery. White orchids, with a note inviting her to dinner to discuss her future with the company. The security camera had captured her blush, the way her fingers had trembled slightly as she read his words. Rising from his chair, Nathaniel walked to his private safe and entered the combination. Inside, along with his most valuable documents, lay a small velvet box containing a 5-carat diamond ring, an investment in his grand design. He wouldn't propose for another 3 months, but everything was already prepared, including the prenuptial agreement that would leave her with nothing when he destroyed her. His phone buzzed, a text from Arabella accepting his dinner invitation. He smiled, imagining her agonizing over the response, trying to keep it professional while conveying her growing personal interest. She probably thought she was being subtle, but he saw everything, every lingering glance, every slight lean toward him during meetings, every nervous adjustment of her hair when he entered a room. Returning to his desk, he opened his laptop and pulled up the document titled Project Arabella. Pages of notes detailed every interaction, every planned coincidence, every calculated gesture. He began typing today's entry. Phase 2 proceeding as planned. Subject responding perfectly to increased personal attention. Dinner invitation accepted for Friday. Location, Le Bernardin. Intimate table in back corner, already arranged with Jacques. Will wear grey Tom Ford suit. Previous positive response noted. Conversation topics prepared, her doctoral aspirations, encourage, family background, sympathetic listening, subtle hints about past relationship disappointments. Physical contact to increase slightly. Help with coat, hand on back while seating, 2 light touches during dinner. Ring to be visible in jacket pocket but not mentioned. A notification popped up on his screen. The background check he'd ordered on Arabella's mother had arrived. He opened it immediately, scanning for anything useful. Every detail about his target's life could be weaponized, every relationship exploited. The report included photos of her mother's modest Brooklyn apartment, her work schedule at the hospital, her weekly routine, all ammunition for future use. Standing at his window, Nathaniel gazed out at the city that had helped make him the man he was, ruthless, powerful, and utterly without mercy. In the reflection of the glass, he adjusted his tie and practiced his expressions, the warm smile that never quite reached his eyes, the concerned frown that suggested depths of understanding, the vulnerable look that made women want to heal his fictional wounds. Friday's dinner would be crucial. He needed to transition their relationship from purely professional to something more personal while maintaining plausible deniability. The restaurant's security cameras would capture everything, another piece of evidence for his growing collection, another strand in his web. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Arabella. "Thank you again for the beautiful flowers, Mr. Benjamin. They're my favorite." He smiled as he typed his response, each word chosen with surgical precision. "Please, call me Nathaniel outside the office." "And you're welcome, Arabella. Beauty should be appreciated." Setting down his phone, he returned to the safe and removed a thick folder labeled Exit Strategy. Inside were documents detailing every step of his ultimate plan. The Christmas party where everything would culminate, the divorce papers that would be served in front of hundreds of guests, the press releases already drafted to control the narrative. But that was still months away. For now, he had a dinner to prepare for, another act to perfect in his theatre of cruelty. As he reviewed his notes one final time, Nathaniel Benjamin allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction. Soon, very soon, another ambitious young woman would learn the price of trusting him. Outside his penthouse windows, Manhattan glittered like a bed of stars, indifferent to the dark drama unfolding in the tower above. In her Brooklyn apartment, Arabella Sebastian was probably trying on outfits for Friday's dinner, her heart full of hope and anticipation, unaware that every flutter of her pulse was just another twist in a spider's web, decades in the making. Love's sweet deception. The city lights twinkled like fallen stars as Arabella stood on the rooftop garden of Le Bernardin, her breath visible in the cool autumn air. 3 months had passed since that first dinner with Nathaniel, and each day felt like stepping deeper into a dream she never wanted to wake from. Tonight, the dream seemed more real than ever as she watched him approach with 2 glasses of champagne, his silver hair catching the soft glow of the fairy lights strung overhead. "To the most brilliant analyst in New York," he said, handing her a crystal flute. The champagne bubbles danced like her heartbeat. Erratic, effervescent, alive with possibility. "You're biased," she laughed, but pleasure warmed her cheeks. The Cartier bracelet he'd given her last week caught the light as she raised her glass. She'd tried to refuse it, too expensive, too intimate, but he'd insisted it was a celebration of her successful market prediction that had earned the company millions. Nathaniel stepped closer, his cologne wrapping around her like an embrace. "I'm a businessman, Ms. Sebastian. I don't do bias, I do facts." His fingers brushed hers as he took her empty glass, sending electricity through her skin. "And the fact is, you're extraordinary." Behind them, a private string quartet began playing softly, another of his surprises. The melody of La Vie en Rose floated through the garden, mixing with the scent of the rare black orchids he'd had imported for the occasion. Everything was perfect, orchestrated with the same precision he brought to his business dealings. "Dance with me?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. They both knew she'd never refuse him anything, not anymore. As they swayed to the music, Arabella's mind wandered back to her mother's warnings. "Baby, he's too smooth, too perfect. Men like that have secrets." But what did her mother know about men like Nathaniel Benjamin? About the way he'd mentor her for hours in his office, genuinely interested in her ideas? About how he'd send his private car when she worked late, worried about her safety? About the way he looked at her like she was the only person in his world? "What are you thinking about?" His voice rumbled against her ear, and she realized she'd been resting her head on his chest. "About how wrong everyone was about you," she admitted. "They said you were cold, ruthless, that you didn't know how to love." Something flickered in his eyes. Triumph? Pain? But it was gone before she could name it. Instead, he led her to the garden's edge, where all of Manhattan spread out before them like a carpet of lights. "Do you see that building?" He pointed to a gleaming tower in the distance. "That's where I first saw you, walking into my office with fire in your eyes and dreams in your heart. I knew then that you were different." Arabella felt tears threatening. No one had ever seen her so clearly, understood her so completely. Her father had been the last person to believe in her this way, and losing him had left a void she thought would never be filled. "I have something for you," Nathaniel said, turning her gently to face him. The city lights haloed his silhouette as he reached into his jacket pocket. Her heart stopped as he dropped to one knee, presenting a ring that caught and multiplied every light in the garden. The diamond was enormous, but it was the smaller stones flanking it that brought fresh tears to her eyes, sapphires, her father's birthstone. "You researched my father's birth month," she whispered, overwhelmed by this evidence of his attention to detail, his care for her history. "I want to know everything about you, Arabella. Your past, your present." He took her trembling hand. "Your future, if you'll share it with me." The proposal that followed was everything she'd never dared to dream of. He spoke of partnership, of building a legacy together, of how her brilliant mind had awakened something in his heart he'd thought long dead. Every word seemed carefully chosen to heal old wounds she'd never even told him about. "Yes," she breathed, and the garden erupted with applause as their friends emerged from hiding spots among the foliage. Arabella recognized faces from the office, from charity galas, from the social circles she'd begun to move in since meeting Nathaniel. Everyone was beaming, celebrating, but she had eyes only for him as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Later that night, in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Arabella sat at the grand piano, playing the piece her father had taught her as a child. Nathaniel watched from his leather armchair, scotch in hand, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Play something else," he suggested softly. "Something new." She complied, as she always did, unaware that he was recording every moment, documenting every smile, every tear of joy. In his study, behind a hidden panel, screens showed multiple angles of the room, capturing her radiant happiness from every perspective, preserving it for the moment he would shatter it all. But for now, he was content to let the performance continue. She was his finest acquisition yet, brilliant, beautiful, and completely convinced of his devotion. As she played, the ring sparkled on her finger, each flash a promise of the destruction to come. Outside, a late autumn wind whipped between the skyscrapers, carrying winter's warning. But in the warmth of the penthouse, Arabella Sebastian, soon to be Arabella Benjamin, wove dreams of forever on piano keys, while the architect of her future doom smiled in the shadows, appreciating the perfection of his deception. The security cameras recorded it all, her joy, his hidden smirks, the way she looked at him with complete trust. Another file for his collection, another scene in the tragedy he was directing, and like all great tragedies, this one would end in tears, though not his own. A wedding of dreams. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had never witnessed such splendor. On a perfect June morning, its great hall had been transformed into a vision that seemed plucked from a fairy tale. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from classical columns, their delicate blooms catching the light that streamed through the magnificent windows. Crystal chandeliers, specially installed for the occasion, cast prismatic rainbows across the marble floors. Arabella stood in the bridal suite, surrounded by a team of designers from Vera Wang herself. The wedding dress, a masterpiece of French lace and silk, had taken 6 months to create. Its trumpet silhouette emphasized her graceful figure, while the cathedral-length train featured hand-embroidered orchids that matched those adorning the hall. A custom tiara, designed by Cartier, held her veil in place. Diamonds and sapphires arranged to mirror the constellations visible on the night Nathaniel proposed. "You look like a queen," her mother whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. She reached out to adjust the veil, her nurse's hands gentle as ever. "Your father would be so proud." Arabella touched the sapphire pendant at her throat, another gift from Nathaniel, selected to honor her father's memory. "Do you think he would have approved, Mom? Of Nathaniel?" Her mother's hesitation was brief, but noticeable. "He would have wanted your happiness, baby girl." The words were careful, measured. "And you are happy, aren't you?" Before Arabella could respond, the wedding planner burst in, clipboard in hand. "It's time! Places everyone!" Outside in the great hall, 800 guests waited in anticipation. The cream of New York society mingled with political figures, international business leaders, and celebrities. Nathaniel had spared no expense, insisting that their wedding would be the social event of the decade. In the front row, his family presented a picture of old money elegance, his mother in Chanel, his sisters in custom Oscar de la Renta. They'd welcomed Arabella with seemingly open arms, though their smiles never quite reached their eyes. Behind them sat rows of business associates, each carefully selected to witness what Nathaniel privately called his greatest performance. As the first notes of the wedding march filled the hall, 1,000 white doves were released in Central Park, their wings catching the summer sunlight. Inside, the assembled guests turned as one as the massive doors swung open to reveal the bride. Arabella began her walk down the aisle, her heart thundering beneath French lace and silk. Each step took her closer to Nathaniel, who stood at the altar looking devastatingly handsome in his Tom Ford tuxedo. His smile, practiced 1,000 times in private, appeared genuine enough to convince even the most skeptical observer. What no one could see was the tiny camera hidden in his boutonniere, recording every moment of what he planned to be his crowning achievement in destruction. In his pocket he carried a handkerchief monogrammed with his initials, and a small remote control that activated dozens of hidden cameras throughout the hall. The ceremony proceeded like a perfectly executed symphony. Their vows, which Nathaniel had spent weeks crafting for maximum impact, brought tears to the eyes of hardened business tycoons. When he slipped the platinum band onto her finger, another Cartier creation, his hands didn't tremble at all, though hers did. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, his words echoing through the great hall. As Nathaniel kissed his bride, flashbulbs erupted like stars, capturing the moment for posterity and evidence. The reception that followed was equally spectacular. The Temple of Dendur had been transformed into a wonderland of lights and flowers. Michelin-starred chefs presented course after course of culinary masterpieces. The cake, a 7-foot-tall creation of sugar orchids and hand-painted fondant, drew gasps of admiration when unveiled. During their first dance, as they swayed to a live performance by a Grammy-winning artist, Nathaniel held Arabella close. "Happy, Mrs. Benjamin," he murmured in her ear. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she whispered back, missing the cold calculation that flickered across his features. As evening fell, the party reached new heights of extravagance. Fireworks exploded over Central Park, choreographed to classical music. Champagne flowed like water, each bottle worth more than most people's monthly salary. Guests received crystal orchids as favors, each one individually crafted by master artisans in Venice. In a quiet moment, Arabella found herself alone in a corner of the vast space, watching the celebration unfold. Her new husband was across the room, charming a group of international investors. She saw him laugh at something someone said, his head thrown back in apparent joy. For a split second, something in his expression seemed off, a coldness in his eyes that contradicted his warm smile, but she blinked and it was gone. "Penny for your thoughts." Nathaniel's mother appeared beside her, elegant as ever in her Chanel suit. "Just taking it all in," Arabella replied, smiling. "It's like a dream." "Yes," the older woman agreed, sipping her champagne. "Dreams are fascinating things, aren't they? So beautiful while they last." Something in her tone made Arabella turn, but her mother-in-law was already gliding away, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and an inexplicable chill. As the night drew to a close, Nathaniel and Arabella prepared to depart for their honeymoon. She had changed into a sleek white traveling suit, also Vera Wang, while he remained impeccable in his tuxedo. They posed for final photos on the museum steps, the New York skyline providing a magnificent backdrop. "Ready to begin our forever?" he asked, helping her into the waiting Rolls-Royce. "With you?" "Always," she replied, missing the shadow of a smirk that crossed his features as he closed the car door. The Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb, trailing ribbons and the traditional "Just Married" sign. Behind them, the Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed like a temple in the night, still echoing with the celebrations of their union. In his private office across town, dozens of hard drives whirred quietly, storing every moment of the day. Ammunition for the destruction to come, but for now, Arabella Benjamin née Sebastian rested her head on her new husband's shoulder, her heart full of dreams, unaware that she had just starred in the most expensive trap ever laid. The wedding ring on her finger caught the passing streetlights, each flash a countdown to the moment when all this happiness would shatter like the crystal chandeliers hanging above the great hall. The city that never sleeps rolled past their windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the Rolls-Royce. In 6 months' time, this would all be evidence in what the society pages would call the scandal of the century. But tonight, love and deception danced together like the 1,000 white doves released in Central Park, their wings catching the light until they disappeared into the gathering darkness. Swiss bliss. The Swiss Alps rose like ancient guardians around the exclusive Gstaad Palace, their snow-capped peaks piercing an impossibly blue sky. From the balcony of the royal suite, Arabella watched her breath form delicate clouds in the crisp mountain air. Below, pristine snow stretched like white velvet, unmarred except for the tracks left by their morning ski lesson. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Benjamin." Nathaniel's voice carried from inside the suite, where he was supposedly reviewing urgent business emails. What she couldn't see was the hidden camera he'd just adjusted, one of many carefully positioned throughout their honeymoon accommodations. "Just thinking how perfect everything is," she replied, turning to find him watching her with that intense gaze that still made her heart skip. He stood in the doorway, devastating in a cashmere sweater that emphasized his athletic frame. Almost too perfect to be real. His laugh held a note she couldn't quite identify. "Nothing's too perfect for my wife." He crossed to her, wrapping her in an embrace that smelled of expensive cologne and the morning's coffee. "Speaking of perfect, are you ready for our chocolate tasting tour?" The Rolls-Royce Ghost, waiting for them as they'd stepped off their private jet a week ago, purred through the winding mountain roads towards Zurich. Arabella watched the scenery through the tinted windows, each vista more breathtaking than the last. Beside her, Nathaniel worked on his tablet, occasionally shooting her fond glances that his hidden cameras captured perfectly. "Did you know," he said, setting aside his work, "that Swiss chocolate makers were the first to add milk to chocolate?" His hand found hers, thumb brushing over her wedding ring. "They're masters of taking something pure and making it even better." The chocolate atelier welcomed them like royalty, unsurprising given the amount Nathaniel had paid for this private experience. The master chocolatier, a distinguished man with silver hair, guided them through rare single-origin chocolates from around the world. Each piece told a story of distant lands and ancient traditions. "This one," the chocolatier said, presenting a particularly dark square, "is from a small plantation in Venezuela. Only 50 kilos are produced each year." He watched as Arabella tasted it, her eyes widening at the complex flavors. "Ah, you have an excellent palate, Madame Benjamin." Nathaniel filmed her reactions openly on his phone, claiming he wanted to remember every moment of their honeymoon. The hidden cameras captured everything else, including the way his smile tightened whenever she wasn't looking. That evening found them in their private chalet, a spectacular property Nathaniel owned in the hills above Moritz. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the timber walls. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Alps glowed pink with the last light of day. "Dance with me," Nathaniel said, extending his hand as music began to play, their wedding song, perfectly timed. They swayed together in the firelight, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happy?" "Deliriously," she murmured, missing the calculated look that crossed his features. "I never imagined I could be this happy." Later, as she slept, Nathaniel sat in his study reviewing the day's footage. Each camera angle showed a young woman completely in love, utterly trusting. His laptop contained folders labeled by date, each filled with evidence of their perfect honeymoon. The final folder was marked Christmas, still empty, waiting. The next morning brought fresh snow and a surprise. A helicopter tour of the Matterhorn. As they soared above the legendary peak, Arabella's face glowed with wonder. Nathaniel's cameras captured everything, her amazement, her joy, the way she squeezed his hand when they flew particularly close to the mountain face. "Look," he pointed, directing her attention to a formation below. "That glacier has been there for thousands of years. Some things seem permanent, unbreakable." His voice held a note of irony she didn't catch. "But even glaciers can shatter under the right conditions." Their days fell into a rhythm of luxury and adventure. Mornings might find them skiing with Olympic instructors, or enjoying couples massages in the chalet's private spa. Afternoons were filled with excursions to hidden mountain villages or private cooking classes with renowned chefs. Evenings brought intimate dinners in exclusive restaurants or cozy moments by their fireplace. Each night, after Arabella had fallen asleep, Nathaniel would retire to his study. There, surrounded by screens showing footage from every room in the chalet, he would make notes in a leather-bound journal. Day 15, subject completely trusting, shows no signs of suspicion despite multiple slip-ups in performance, particularly vulnerable during mountain picnic, emotional about father's memory, potential leverage point for future use. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Arabella found an old photo album in the chalet's library. "Look at this," she called to Nathaniel. "Is this you as a child?" He joined her on the leather sofa, taking the album. "Ah, yes, my first trip to Switzerland." The photo showed a serious-looking boy standing with his parents outside this very chalet. "I learned something important that year." "What was that?" His smile held secrets she couldn't decode. "That appearances can be deceiving. The snow looks so soft, so pure, but underneath it's just frozen water. Hard, unforgiving." He closed the album abruptly. "Shall we have dinner?" Their final week brought them to Lucerne, where they stayed in a suite overlooking the famous lake. During a private boat tour, Nathaniel presented Arabella with a gift, a platinum watch adorned with diamonds and sapphires. "For my perfect wife," he said, fastening it around her wrist. "To count the perfect moments we'll share." That night, as she admired the watch in their suite's marble bathroom, she didn't see him checking the tiny camera hidden in its face. Another piece of evidence, another nail in a coffin she didn't know was being built. Their last evening in Switzerland found them back in their chalet. Arabella packed their belongings, while Nathaniel made one final check of his hidden equipment. Everything had been recorded, every moment of apparent perfection preserved for future use. "I'm going to miss this place," Arabella said, as they prepared to leave. "It's been like living in a fairy tale." Nathaniel pulled her close, kissing her forehead, as 3 different cameras captured the moment. "All fairy tales must end, my dear." His smile didn't reach his eyes. but ours is just beginning. The Rolls-Royce carried them back through the mountain passes toward the waiting private jet. Behind them, the Alps stood silent and knowing, their peaks hiding centuries of secrets. In his briefcase, Nathaniel carried hard drives full of honeymoon footage, ammunition for a destruction still months away. Arabella slept against his shoulder during the flight home, her new watch ticking away precious seconds of happiness. Each tick brought them closer to Christmas, to the moment when all this careful documentation would serve its true purpose. But for now, she dreamed of snow and chocolate and love, while beside her, her husband reviewed his plans for her downfall on a tablet protected by fingerprint recognition and a password that was her father's birth date. New York awaited them, its skyline promising new chapters in their story. Only one of them knew how that story would end. Christmas preparations. Snow fell softly over Manhattan as Arabella stood in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, directing an army of decorators with the precision of a field marshal. 6 months of marriage had given her the confidence to handle such massive undertakings. After all, she was now Mrs. Nathaniel Benjamin, and this would be their first Christmas party as a couple. "The crystal snowflakes need to catch the light just so," she instructed, pointing to the enormous chandeliers, "and the orchids should cascade down each pillar like frozen waterfalls." Her vision was ambitious, transforming the legendary space into a winter wonderland that would merge her cultural heritage with Nathaniel's old money traditions. Behind her, an assistant frantically took notes on an iPad. "Mrs. Benjamin, about the ice sculptures." "Yes, we'll need 12, one for each month of our first year together." Arabella smiled, touching the sapphire pendant at her throat. "And make sure the largest one incorporates both orchids and snowflakes. It's about bringing two worlds together." What she couldn't see was Nathaniel's assistant in a corner, recording every detail of her plans in a separate document titled Evidence File Party Preparations. Each decision, each loving touch she added to make the party perfect, would later be used to demonstrate just how completely she had been deceived. In his office, 90 stories above Manhattan, Nathaniel reviewed the guest list with cold satisfaction. 800 of New York's elite would witness his masterpiece of destruction. He'd carefully chosen each attendee for maximum impact. Business rivals who'd watch with secret glee. Society matrons who'd spread the story at every charity gala. Journalists who'd ensure the humiliation went national. "Sir," his private secretary entered with a thick folder, "the final arrangements are confirmed. Security will be positioned as requested, and all cameras will be in place." "Excellent." He opened the folder, reviewing the timeline that had been planned with military precision. "And the special delivery. The papers will arrive at exactly 9:47 p.m. during her speech about your first year together." Nathaniel smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Perfect. She always did have excellent dramatic timing, even if she doesn't know it yet. Back at the plaza, Arabella was reviewing the menu with the hotel's executive chef. Each course had been carefully chosen to tell the story of their romance. Caviar from their first dinner together, chocolate from their Swiss honeymoon, wines from vineyards they'd visited together. "The dessert needs to be spectacular," she insisted, "something that captures the magic of Christmas and love combined." The chef presented his design, a chocolate sculpture of the Manhattan skyline, dusted with edible silver, with tiny lit windows made of sugar. At its center, the Benjamin Tower would stand tallest, a sugar-spun couple dancing in its penthouse. "It's perfect," Arabella breathed, not noticing how the chef's assistant quickly photographed her reaction, sending it directly to Nathaniel's private server. That evening, as she finally returned to their penthouse, she found Nathaniel in his study, supposedly working late as usual. In reality, he was reviewing footage from the dozens of hidden cameras that had documented their entire marriage. "Darling," He greeted her with practiced warmth. "How are the party preparations coming along?" She sank onto his lap, her face glowing with excitement. "Wait until you see what I've planned. It's going to be magical." She didn't feel how his body stiffened slightly at her touch, didn't notice how his returning embrace was calculated to appear loving while maintaining careful distance. "I'm sure it will be unforgettable," he replied, and for once his smile was genuine, though not for the reasons she imagined. The weeks leading up to Christmas became a whirlwind of activity. Arabella threw herself into every detail, handwriting place cards in silver ink, selecting the perfect lighting to flatter every guest, choosing music that would tell the story of their love through carefully curated songs. She even designed custom party favors, crystal ornaments containing miniature orchids preserved in resin, each one accompanied by a handwritten note about love and new beginnings. The irony of her efforts was not lost on Nathaniel as he watched her work late into the night, perfecting every detail of what would become her own public execution. One evening, while reviewing RSVPs, she found him staring at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "What is it?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking about how perfect you are," he replied, his words carrying a double meaning she couldn't grasp. "This party will show everyone exactly who you are." A week before Christmas, Arabella invited her mother to see the ballroom's transformation. The space had become a symphony in white and silver, with touches of deep blue, the sapphire shade that had become their signature. "Baby girl," her mother said slowly, taking in the grandeur, "all this must have cost a fortune. Nathaniel insisted I spare no expense." Arabella adjusted a crystal snowflake. "He says our first Christmas together should be memorable." Her mother's expression held a warning she didn't know how to voice. "Some memories come at a very high price, child." But Arabella was too busy directing the placement of an ice sculpture to notice her mother's concern. She'd thrown herself completely into creating the perfect celebration of their perfect love, never suspecting that each loving detail would become evidence of her complete devotion, and therefore her complete humiliation. The night before the party, Arabella worked until midnight, personally checking every detail. The ballroom had become her vision made real, a winter paradise where love and luxury merged. Ice sculptures caught and reflected light like diamonds. Orchestra platforms waited for world-class musicians. The massive Christmas tree, reaching toward the gilded ceiling, sparkled with thousands of white lights and crystal ornaments. When she finally returned home, she found a gift-wrapped box on her pillow. Inside was a stunning white gown from her favorite designer, with a note in Nathaniel's precise handwriting, "For tomorrow night. You'll take their breath away." What she didn't know was that the dress had been chosen specifically for its dramatic effect against the dark wood of the plaza's grand staircase, where photographers would capture her moment of devastation. In his study, Nathaniel made his final preparations. The divorce papers waited in a handmade box of white leather, wrapped in silver paper with a cruel precision. Security cameras had been strategically placed to capture every angle of her humiliation. Press releases were prepared, each crafted to paint him as the victim of a social climber's ambitions. Tomorrow night, his masterpiece would be complete. But for now, he watched through hidden cameras as his wife slept peacefully, dreaming of the perfect Christmas party she had planned with such love and care. Outside, snow continued to fall on Manhattan, coating the city in a deceptive blanket of pure white. Like the snow, everything beautiful can hide something cold and hard beneath. Tomorrow night, Arabella would learn that lesson in the cruelest way possible, in front of 800 witnesses who would never let her forget it. The crystal snowflakes in the plaza ballroom caught the light and threw rainbows on the walls, counting down the hours until celebration would turn to devastation and love would reveal its frozen heart. The gift box of betrayal. The Plaza Hotel blazed with light on Christmas Eve, its facade glowing like a castle made of stars. Inside the transformed Grand Ballroom, 800 of New York's elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers and cascading orchids. Ice sculptures caught and fractured light, sending rainbow shards dancing across the snow-white decor that Arabella had so lovingly chosen. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, a vision in white couture that made her dark skin glow like satin. The dress Nathaniel had chosen fit her perfectly, its train spreading behind her like fresh snow. Diamonds and sapphires adorned her throat and wrists, 6 months of love gifts that would soon reveal their true price. "You look stunning, darling." Nathaniel appeared beside her, devastating in a black tuxedo that made his silver hair gleam. He offered his arm with practiced elegance. "Shall we make our entrance?" The orchestra, positioned exactly as Arabella had specified, began playing their wedding song. Heads turned as the couple descended the staircase, cameras flashing to capture what seemed like a perfect moment. No one noticed the cold calculation in Nathaniel's eyes, or how his smile never quite reached them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, "Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Benjamin." Applause erupted through the ballroom. Arabella's heart swelled with pride and love as she surveyed their guests. Business tycoons, society mavens, political figures, all gathered to celebrate their first Christmas together. She didn't know that each had been carefully selected for their role in her imminent humiliation. The evening proceeded according to her meticulous planning. Dinner was served on gilt-edged china, each course paired with wines she'd personally selected. The chocolate Manhattan skyline drew gasps of appreciation when unveiled, its tiny lit windows twinkling like the real city visible through the ballroom's massive windows. "A toast," Nathaniel stood, raising his crystal flute, "to my beautiful wife, who has made this evening as perfect as she is." His voice carried through the perfect acoustics she'd insisted upon. "Arabella, you've transformed not just this room, but my entire world." She blinked back happy tears, missing the subtle signals he sent to his staff. Around the room, hidden cameras activated, their lenses focusing on her radiant face. After dinner, as the orchestra played and couples swirled across the dance floor, Arabella made her way through the crowd, accepting compliments on her impeccable taste. Each guest praised a different detail: the ice sculptures, the lighting, the handwritten place cards, all evidence of her complete devotion to creating their perfect Christmas. "Such attention to detail," Nathaniel's mother commented, her smile as brittle as the crystal snowflakes overhead. "You really put your whole heart into this, didn't you?" "Of course," Arabella beamed. "It's our first Christmas together. Everything had to be perfect." At precisely 9:45 p.m., Nathaniel clinked his glass for attention. The music faded, the dancers stilled, and all eyes turned to the grand staircase where he stood with a white leather box in his hands. "My darling wife," his voice carried clearly through the hushed room, "you've created such magic tonight. Now it's my turn to surprise you." Arabella's heart fluttered as she made her way toward him. In the 6 months of their marriage, his gifts had always been spectacular. What could he have planned for Christmas? "A special delivery arrived for you," he continued as she reached him. The box, wrapped in silver paper and tied with a silk ribbon, gleamed under the chandelier lights. Something to mark this memorable evening. She took the box with trembling fingers, aware of hundreds of eyes watching. The ribbon came undone easily, the paper falling away to reveal rich white leather embossed with her initials. Behind her, cameras whirred silently, capturing every moment. "Open it," Nathaniel instructed, his voice carrying a note she'd never heard before. The lid lifted smoothly on golden hinges. Inside, nestled on white velvet, lay a thick stack of papers. Arabella's smile faltered as she read the first page. Petition for divorce. The words seemed to float before her eyes, black ink burning into her retinas. The ballroom went silent, except for the soft click of camera shutters. "Did you really think," Nathaniel's voice had turned to ice, "that someone like me would stay married to someone like you?" The box slipped from her nerveless fingers, papers spilling across the marble floor. She became aware of murmurs in the crowd, of phones being raised to record her devastation. 6 months of marriage, he continued, his tone dripping with cruel amusement. 6 months of documenting every loving gesture, every devoted act, every moment you spent trying to prove yourself worthy of the Benjamin name. He gestured to the room around them. All this effort you put into tonight, just more evidence of your desperate social climbing. Arabella stared at him, her world cracking like the ice sculptures she'd so carefully chosen. "Nathaniel, I don't understand." "Of course you don't." His smile was terrible to behold. "You actually believed I could love you. That's what makes this so perfect." Security guards appeared at the foot of the stairs. Through her shock, Arabella recognized them. The same men who had protected her for 6 months, who had driven her to charity events and shopping appointments. Now they stood ready to remove her from her own party. "You'll find your personal belongings have been packed and delivered to your old apartment," Nathaniel announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The prenup you signed is ironclad. You leave with exactly what you came with, nothing." The crowd had gone completely silent. Hundreds of faces watched her destruction, with expressions ranging from horror to poorly concealed glee. Someone was live-streaming the whole thing. Why? The word escaped her lips like a wounded animal's cry. "Because I could." He descended the stairs, leaving her alone at the top. "Because watching you try so hard, believing you could belong in my world, was the most entertaining thing I've ever seen." He turned to face her one last time. "Consider it a lesson in knowing your place." Arabella's legs gave way. She sank to her knees, the white dress pooling around her like fallen snow. The sapphires at her throat felt like ice against her skin. Every gift he'd given her, every loving gesture, every moment of their life together, all had been moves in an elaborate game of destruction. "Please escort my soon-to-be ex-wife out," Nathaniel commanded. "The party will continue without her." As security approached, Arabella forced herself to stand. The daughter of a professor and a nurse, she'd been raised with dignity. She would not be dragged out. With her head held high, tears streaming silently down her face, she descended the staircase. The crowd parted before her like water, phones recording her final walk through the winter wonderland she'd created with such love. At the ballroom doors, she paused for a moment, looking back at the man who had orchestrated her destruction. Nathaniel raised his champagne glass in a mocking toast, and the orchestra began to play again, as if nothing had happened. Outside, snow was falling on Fifth Avenue. The same doorman, who had greeted her warmly hours before, now called a taxi without meeting her eyes. As she slid into the back seat, she heard laughter and music resuming in the ballroom behind her. The taxi pulled away from the plaza, carrying her through streets decorated for a Christmas she would never celebrate. In her clutch, along with her phone and lipstick, was one small item she'd managed to save. A USB drive containing copies of every business document she'd handled during their marriage. Nathaniel had taught her well about keeping records, perhaps too well. The city lights blurred through her tears as the taxi headed toward Brooklyn, where her old apartment waited with her hastily packed belongings. Behind her, the plaza continued to glow, its warmth now as false as the love she'd believed in. But somewhere beneath her broken heart, in a place even Nathaniel's cruelty couldn't reach, a small flame of revenge began to flicker. Tears and steel. The Brooklyn apartment felt smaller than Arabella remembered. Boxes of her hastily packed belongings crowded the small space, designer labels and luxury items looking out of place against the worn hardwood floors. She sat in darkness, still wearing the white gown from the party, her phone lighting up endlessly with notifications as videos of her humiliation went viral. The first rays of Christmas morning sunlight crept through her window, catching the sapphire pendant at her throat. With trembling fingers, she unclasped it, along with every other piece of jewelry Nathaniel had given her. Each gem represented a calculated move in his game of destruction. Her mother had called 17 times. Friends from her old life, before Nathaniel, had left dozens of messages. But Arabella wasn't ready to speak to anyone. Her mind kept replaying every moment of their 6-month marriage, re-examining each gesture, each word, each loving touch through the lens of betrayal. The USB drive sat on her small kitchen counter, innocent-looking despite the power it contained. As Nathaniel's wife, she'd had access to every corner of his business empire. As his junior analyst, she'd processed documents that most of his senior executives never saw. He'd trusted her completely, believing she was too in love, too grateful, to ever betray him. That had been his first mistake. Rising on shaky legs, Arabella walked to her bedroom closet. Behind the designer gowns Nathaniel's staff had carelessly thrown in boxes, she found what she was looking for, her old laptop from university. It wasn't as sophisticated as the equipment she'd grown used to, but it would serve. She booted up the computer and plugged in the USB drive. Folders upon folders of documents appeared. Merger agreements, offshore accounts, tax structures that didn't quite add up. For 6 months, she'd quietly copied everything that crossed her desk, telling herself it was just to learn the business better. Now she realized it had been instinct, the same instinct that had made her father teach her to always have a backup plan. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Patricia Chen, a senior partner at New York's most feared law firm. They'd met at a charity gala 3 months ago, and Arabella had helped her daughter get an internship at Benjamin Enterprises. What he did was unforgivable. "When you're ready to fight back, call me. I'll take your case pro bono." A tear splashed onto the phone screen, but this time it wasn't from sadness. Opening her laptop's browser, Arabella began researching New York's divorce laws. She'd been an exceptional analyst before becoming Nathaniel's wife. Now those skills would serve a different purpose. As the sun rose fully over Brooklyn, Arabella Sebastian, she would never use his name again, began to plan. Nathaniel had spent 6 months documenting her love and devotion. But he wasn't the only one who knew how to keep records. Her finger hovered over Patricia Chen's number. It was time to show Nathaniel Benjamin that he wasn't the only one who could play a long game. The white designer gown lay discarded on her bed, like a snake's shed skin. In its place, Arabella put on her old Yale sweatshirt and jeans. The transformation from society wife back to determined professional was beginning. Her laptop screen glowed with possibility as she opened the first folder of evidence. Christmas carols drifted up from the street below, but in apartment 4B, a different kind of holiday spirit was taking shape, one made of tears and steel, of broken dreams and unbreakable determination. Nathaniel had taught her well about power, about patience, about playing the perfect role until the moment of strike. Now she would show him exactly how good a student she had been. She picked up her phone and dialed Patricia Chen's number. "Hello," she said, her voice steady for the first time since leaving the plaza. "I'm ready to fight back." Outside, snow continued to fall on New York City, covering everything in clean white powder, but in a small Brooklyn apartment, plans were being made that would strip away all pretense of purity, revealing the hard truth beneath the glittering surface of Nathaniel Benjamin's world. The war was about to begin. The silent partner. The offices of Chen, Rodriguez and Associates occupied the entire 45th floor of a sleek Manhattan tower. 3 weeks had passed since Christmas Eve, and Arabella sat in Patricia Chen's corner office, surrounded by evidence of her 6-month marriage. The wall of windows offered a clear view of the Benjamin Tower, its distinctive silhouette a constant reminder of her purpose. "Let me understand this correctly," Patricia said, elegant in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Arabella's old monthly salary. "During your entire courtship and marriage, you kept records of everything?" Arabella nodded, opening her laptop. "At first it was just habit. My father always taught me to document important things." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up folder after folder. "Then I noticed patterns in Nathaniel's behavior that made me cautious." Patricia leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Show me." The first folder contained emails, hundreds of them. Conversations where Nathaniel had revealed his prejudices, carefully worded but clear to anyone who knew how to read between the lines. Comments about certain people not belonging in his social circle. Directives to human resources about maintaining the company's traditional culture. "He was careful never to be explicit," Arabella explained, "but the pattern is there, and I wasn't the first." The second folder revealed her real discovery: 3 previous marriages, each following the same pattern. Young, accomplished women of color, all systematically destroyed in public spectacles. The divorces had been quietly settled, the records sealed, but Arabella had found connections through society page archives and financial records. "Here," she pointed to a series of transfers. Each time, large payments were made to gossip columnists just before the divorces were announced. He didn't just want to leave them, he wanted to destroy them publicly. Patricia's eyebrows rose as she examined the evidence. "And you found all this while playing the perfect devoted wife." "I was an analyst before I was his wife," Arabella reminded her. "Processing data, finding patterns. That's what I do, or did, before he decided I was better suited to planning parties." The next series of folders made Patricia sit up straighter. Financial records, tax documents, merger agreements, all showing discrepancies that pointed to something darker beneath the Benjamin Enterprises facade. "These offshore accounts," Patricia mused, "they don't appear in any public filings, and these property transfers—" She looked at Arabella with new respect. "You didn't just collect evidence of his personal cruelty. You found his business vulnerabilities." Arabella allowed herself a small smile. Nathaniel loved to brag about how he'd risen above his competition through superior intelligence. He never considered that his wife might be paying attention to more than just party plans. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Manhattan as they continued reviewing evidence. Patricia's associates came and went, each bringing new perspectives on different aspects of the case. A tax expert whistled softly at some of the documents. A civil rights attorney took copious notes about the pattern of discrimination. "There's one more thing," Arabella said as evening approached. She pulled out a final USB drive, this one smaller than the others. 2 days before the Christmas party, Nathaniel asked me to review some routine contract updates. He was distracted, planning my humiliation. He didn't notice that one of them was the amendment to your prenuptial agreement," Patricia finished, her eyes widening as she read. "And he signed it." "He signed everything I put in front of him that week." He was so focused on his grand performance, he never thought to question why his loving wife would be handling legal documents. The amendment was subtle, but crucial. One paragraph, buried in legal jargon, essentially nullified the original prenup's most restrictive clauses in the event of deliberate psychological or emotional distress inflicted through public humiliation. "My father was a professor of contract law," Arabella explained quietly. "He taught me to always read the fine print and to add some of my own when necessary. Patricia removed her glasses, looking at her client with new appreciation. So when Nathaniel orchestrated that public spectacle at the plaza, he triggered the clause himself. According to this amendment, I'm entitled to 50% of all assets acquired during the marriage, including his company shares. Arabella's voice was steady. He spent 6 months documenting my devotion and dedication. Now all that evidence proves the deliberate nature of his cruelty. The sun had set over Manhattan, office lights twinkling like stars. In the Benjamin Tower, Nathaniel was probably working late, confident in his victory, unaware that his perfect plan had overlooked one crucial detail. He had underestimated the woman he'd chosen to destroy. "We'll need to move carefully," Patricia cautioned, already making notes. "He'll fight back hard when he realizes what's happening." "Let him," Arabella replied, her voice carrying an edge of steel. "I spent 6 months playing the perfect wife, learning his weaknesses, understanding his patterns. He taught me about power, about patience, about waiting for the perfect moment to strike." She stood, gathering her evidence. "Now, I'll show him how well I learned those lessons." The next few hours were spent planning strategy. Patricia's team identified multiple angles of attack: civil rights violations for the pattern of discrimination, securities fraud for the hidden accounts, tax evasion for the questionable transfers. The public humiliation aspect would make it impossible to keep the proceedings private, exactly what Nathaniel had wanted for his victims, now turned against him. "What about the other women?" Arabella asked. "The ones before me?" Patricia smiled grimly. "I've already reached out. 2 have agreed to testify. The 3rd is considering it. Your evidence gives them the opportunity they never had, to fight back without risking everything." As midnight approached, the strategy was set. Papers would be filed simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions. Press releases were prepared, turning Nathaniel's love of public spectacle into a weapon against him. Every piece of evidence was backed up in multiple secure locations. "One last thing," Patricia said as Arabella prepared to leave. "He'll try to paint you as a gold digger, a social climber who planned this from the beginning." Arabella's laugh held no humor. "Let him try. Every security camera in his house, every recording device he planted to document my devotion, they all prove I was exactly what I seemed, a woman who loved him, whom he chose to destroy for his own amusement." She paused at the office door, looking out at the city that had witnessed her humiliation. Nathaniel's mistake wasn't in marrying me. It wasn't even in betraying me. His mistake was in teaching me everything I needed to know to destroy him, then giving me 6 months to plan how to do it. Patricia watched her client walk to the elevator, head high, steps sure. In 20 years of practicing law, she'd never seen someone turn victimhood into victory with such precision. Nathaniel Benjamin had wanted to make an example of his young wife. He was about to get his wish, just not in the way he'd planned. In the elevator, Arabella touched the sapphire pendant she still wore, her last gift from the man who'd tried to break her. Soon, very soon, he would learn that some things don't break when you apply pressure. Some things become diamonds. Outside, New York continued its endless dance of lights and shadows, unaware that one of its greatest dramas was about to unfold. In her small Brooklyn apartment, evidence waited in encrypted files. In Patricia's office, legal documents were being prepared. And in his penthouse office, Nathaniel Benjamin worked late, not yet knowing that his greatest victory was about to become his most spectacular defeat. The game had changed, and this time, Arabella was writing the rules. Justice served cold. The headline splashed across the Wall Street Journal made Nathaniel Benjamin choke on his morning coffee. Benjamin Enterprises CEO faces multiple lawsuits, pattern of discrimination, financial fraud alleged. His hands trembled as he read further, seeing his perfectly crafted world beginning to crack. In her Brooklyn apartment, Arabella watched the news unfold on multiple screens. Financial networks buzzed with speculation about Benjamin Enterprises' hidden accounts. Social media exploded with stories from former employees corroborating patterns of discrimination. 3 months of careful preparation had led to this moment. "The timing is perfect," Patricia Chen said over the secure line they'd established. "Markets opening in 10 minutes. Are you ready?" Arabella looked at her laptop, where a carefully crafted email waited to be sent to the company's board of directors. "Everything's in place. Did you get confirmation from the others? All 3 of your predecessors are going public with their stories at noon. Their interviews are already recorded. No chance for Nathaniel to silence them now." The plan they'd crafted was executing with precision. Securities fraud investigations would freeze major assets. Civil rights violations would attract federal attention. And the carefully documented pattern of psychological abuse would make it impossible to keep the proceedings private. Exactly what Nathaniel had always wanted for his victims. In his office, 90 stories above Manhattan, Nathaniel was discovering just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. His phone rang constantly, board members demanding explanations, investors threatening to pull out, journalists seeking comments. But the real shock came when his corporate counsel called. "The prenup amendment," the lawyer's voice shook. "Did you even read what you signed?" "What are you talking about? It was just routine updates. My wife handled all that." His voice trailed off as realization dawned. "Your wife, the analyst you hired for her brilliant mind, then reduced to planning parties. She buried a clause that activates in case of public humiliation. It's ironclad, Nathaniel. She owns half of everything now." The coffee cup shattered against his office wall. "Fix it!" "We can't. Every second of that Christmas party performance you staged, it proves deliberate psychological abuse. And she has evidence of similar patterns with your previous marriages. The press is calling it systematic racial and gender-based destruction." Nathaniel slumped in his chair, remembering all the documents he'd blindly signed while planning Arabella's humiliation. She'd been so efficient, so devoted, handling all those tedious details while he plotted her downfall. Now he realized she'd been plotting too, and far more effectively. At precisely noon, 3 elegant women appeared on different news networks. Each told a similar story: marriage to Nathaniel Benjamin, followed by calculated destruction. But this time, they had evidence. Arabella had found the patterns, connected the dots, given them the ammunition they'd never had before. "He didn't just hurt us," one explained to a riveted audience. "He documented everything, kept videos of our pain like trophies." But Arabella was smarter. She documented his cruelty, his discrimination, his financial tricks. She's given us all a chance at justice. Benjamin Enterprises' stock began to plummet. Board members called an emergency meeting. Federal investigators arrived at corporate headquarters with warrants. And in every story, every report, every analysis, one fact stood out. Nathaniel Benjamin had been outplayed at his own game. The evidence was devastating in its completeness. Emails showing systematic discrimination, financial records revealing tax evasion, security footage from his own cameras showing him bragging about destroying women's lives. Everything he'd so carefully hidden, exposed by the woman he'd thought too lovesick to notice. "Your offshore accounts are frozen," his financial advisor reported. "The SEC is investigating those shell companies in the Caymans, and the Civil Rights Division is treating this as a pattern of targeted racial discrimination." Nathaniel tried calling his society friends, but doors suddenly closed. The same people who'd laughed at Arabella's humiliation now distanced themselves, not wanting to be tainted by association. His own mother's phone went straight to voicemail. Late that evening, as his empire crumbled around him, Nathaniel received one final email. The sender, Arabella Sebastian. "You taught me well," it read, "about power about patience, about documenting everything. Consider this your final lesson. Never underestimate what you dismiss as beneath you. P.S. The sapphires were fake. In her Brooklyn apartment, Arabella closed her laptop with a sense of completion. The news channel still buzzed with revelations. Social media exploded with support for her and the other women. But more importantly, justice was being served, cold, precise and complete. Patricia Chen called with updates. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your controlling interest in the company. The SEC has enough evidence for criminal charges. And those tax evasion cases, they're just the beginning. And the other women, their cases are being reopened. With your evidence and their testimony, he'll be paying damages for years. Plus, the publicity makes it impossible for him to silence anyone else. Arabella walked to her window, looking out at the Brooklyn streets where she'd grown up learning her father's lessons about justice and her mother's about resilience. In the distance, the Benjamin Tower stood like a needle against the sky, but its power over her was gone. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nathaniel's third wife. "Thank you for giving us all a voice." Justice, Arabella had learned, wasn't always about courtrooms and judges. Sometimes it was about patience, about gathering evidence, about waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. Nathaniel had taught her that, though not in the way he'd intended. As night fell over New York, news tickers continued to report the unfolding scandal. In his penthouse office, Nathaniel Benjamin faced the ruins of his carefully constructed world. And in Brooklyn, Arabella Sebastian prepared for tomorrow's board meeting, her first as controlling shareholder of Benjamin Enterprises. The game was over, and the student had become the master. The man who loved destroying lives was about to lose everything he valued, brought down by the very weapons he'd taught his last victim to use. Sometimes justice is best served not with heat of revenge, but with the cold precision of a lesson well learned. The last Christmas, 1 year to the day after her public humiliation, Arabella Sebastian stood in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The space had been transformed once again, but this time the decorations told a different story. Instead of pure white, the color scheme featured deep blues and silvers, representing strength emerging from cold times. Where ice sculptures had stood, now blazed warming fires in elegant copper braziers. She wore blue this year, a designer gown the color of twilight, adorned with real sapphires that caught the light like stars. The jewelry had been her first purchase after taking control of Benjamin Enterprises, a reminder that some things that look delicate can withstand immense pressure. "Miss Sebastian?" Her assistant approached discreetly. "They're ready." Through the ballroom's windows, she could see police lights flashing on Fifth Avenue, right on schedule. She checked her watch, a new one chosen by herself, for herself, and nodded. "Let's begin." The past year had been one of transformation. After the evidence went public, Benjamin Enterprises had faced a crisis of confidence. But Arabella, drawing on the brilliant mind Nathaniel had tried to dismiss, had steered the company in a new direction. Under her leadership, the firm established the largest corporate scholarship program for minority students in the country. The trading floor, once a bastion of old money privilege, now buzzed with diverse voices and fresh perspectives. "Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the gathered crowd, smaller than last year, but more genuine. "Welcome to our first annual Foundation for New Beginnings Gala." The faces before her included familiar ones. Patricia Chen, now head of the company's expanded legal department. Nathaniel's previous wives, each now successful in her own right thanks to the substantial settlements they'd received. Young analysts and executives hired on merit rather than pedigree. And in the back, watching proudly, her mother in a gown that finally suited her grace. 1 year ago in this room, a man attempted to teach me a lesson about power. Her voice carried clearly, just as it had during those analyst presentations Nathaniel had praised while plotting her destruction. He succeeded, though not in the way he intended. On cue, the ballroom's doors opened. Two federal agents escorted Nathaniel Benjamin, no longer imposing in his designer suit, now wrinkled from his day in court. His silver hair had lost its luster, his confident smirk replaced by a look of defeated rage. "Mr. Benjamin," Arabella acknowledged him coolly, "thank you for joining us. I believe you remember this room?" The gathered crowd parted as the agents led him forward. Many held phones recording the moment. Nathaniel's love of public spectacle had come full circle. "You think you've won," he snarled, but his voice lacked its old authority. The evidence Arabella had gathered had stripped away more than his wealth. It had exposed the hollowness behind his power. "No, Nathaniel," she replied calmly. "I think justice has won. There's a difference." She gestured to one of her assistants, who approached with a familiar white leather box. "I believe this belongs to you." Inside lay the divorce papers he'd given her last Christmas, now accompanied by federal indictments, civil judgments, and documentation of his complete financial ruin. His own cameras had provided the evidence. His own recordings proved the pattern of abuse. His own arrogance had blinded him to the trap closing around him. "Take him away," she instructed the agents. As they led him out, she called after him, "Consider it your last lesson in underestimating those you thought beneath you." The party resumed, but this celebration was genuine. The foundation would provide opportunities for countless young people who, like Arabella once had, dreamed of succeeding on merit rather than privilege. The Benjamin name would become synonymous not with destruction, but with redemption. Later that evening, as snow began to fall on Fifth Avenue, Arabella stood on the plaza's balcony. The city spread before her, its lights twinkling like the real sapphires at her throat. Behind her, the sound of genuine laughter and joy replaced the cruel amusement of last year's gathering. Her phone buzzed, a message from Patricia. "Final appeal denied. It's really over." Arabella smiled, watching the snowflakes dance in the winter air. In her office at the Benjamin Tower, soon to be renamed for her father's favorite philosophical principle, justice through truth, sat the evidence of her victory. But more importantly, in universities across the country, young students were receiving scholarships that would help them break through the barriers Nathaniel had tried so hard to maintain. The company shares he'd given her as part of his plan to destroy her had become the foundation of something new. The wealth he'd accumulated through destruction now funded construction, of opportunities, of dreams, of futures he'd tried to deny. A year ago, she'd left this building in tears, broken but not destroyed. Tonight she'd watched her destroyer led away in handcuffs while she stood triumphant in the room where he'd tried to end her story. But Arabella knew this wasn't really an ending. Walking back into the warmth of the ballroom, she surveyed her guests. Diverse, accomplished, genuine people building something new from the ashes of the old order. This was her real victory, not just surviving Nathaniel's attempt to destroy her, but transforming his weapons of destruction into tools for change. The sapphires at her throat caught the light as she raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she toasted, and hundreds of voices echoed her words. In the distance, police sirens faded as Nathaniel Benjamin began his journey to federal prison, while in the Plaza Hotel ballroom, Arabella Sebastian began her new chapter. Outside, snow continued to fall on Manhattan, coating the city in fresh white powder. But this year, the pure surface reflected truth rather than deception, promise rather than pretense. In the end, Nathaniel's carefully documented cruelty had become evidence of his own destruction, while Arabella's carefully hidden strength had become the foundation of a new legacy. Some called it revenge, but Arabella knew better. This was justice, served not just cold, but with the precision of a lesson learned and taught again, transforming pain into purpose, betrayal into blessing, and one woman's story of survival into a beacon of hope for others. The last Christmas of the old order had become the first Christmas of the new, and in the grand ballroom where her story had seemed to end, Arabella Sebastian raised her glass once more, not in triumph over a fallen enemy, but in celebration of all the stories yet to begin. And here are the powerful lessons and motivational takeaways from Arabella's story for anyone who has faced betrayal. Education and intelligence are your greatest assets. Arabella's analytical mind and education were what ultimately saved her. Instead of just being a victim, she used her skills to document everything. Knowledge and competence can't be taken away from you. Keep developing your skills, even when others try to diminish them. Trust your instincts. Arabella's mother and friends had warnings about Nathaniel. She kept records despite appearing to trust completely. If something feels wrong, pay attention to those feelings. Document concerning patterns and behaviors. Turn pain into power. Arabella didn't let her humiliation destroy her. She transformed her betrayal into fuel for justice, used the very tools meant to destroy her, documentation, public spectacle, as weapons, channeled her experience into helping others through the foundation. You are more than your relationship. Arabella maintained her core identity despite Nathaniel's attempts to reduce her. She didn't let his betrayal define her worth, kept her professional skills sharp, even when pushed into a limited role. Drew strength from her family background and education. Proper preparation prevents victory for abusers. Document everything in toxic situations. Keep copies of important papers and communications. Maintain your own financial records. Have your own support system, independent of your partner. Justice requires strategy, not just anger. Arabella didn't act on pure emotion. She planned carefully and built an airtight case, sought professional help, lawyers, at the right time, used the legal system effectively, help others rise. Arabella didn't just get revenge, she created positive change, used her victory to help other victims come forward, created opportunities for others through scholarships, transformed a toxic company culture. Your greatest setback can become your greatest comeback. The very event meant to destroy her became her path to greater success. She took control of the company that was used against her, transformed her public humiliation into public triumph, used her experience to create positive change. Never let anyone dim your light. Arabella maintained her dignity even in humiliation, kept her professional capabilities despite being underestimated, stayed true to her values while fighting back, proved her worth through actions, not arguments, support other women connected with previous victims to build a stronger case, used her victory to help other women seek justice, created opportunities for future generations, transformed a system that hurt women into one that helped them. The ultimate message: your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you rise after betrayal. Education, preparation, and strategic thinking are more powerful than any betrayal. Don't just survive. Transform your pain into power and use it to create positive change for yourself and others. Remember, like Arabella, you can turn a moment meant for your destruction into the foundation of your greatest triumph. The key is to stay smart, keep records, trust your instincts, seek proper help, and never lose sight of your own worth. This story teaches us that the best revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about getting better and helping others rise above similar situations. Your betrayal can become the beginning of a new chapter that helps not just you, but many others find justice and success.